Welcome to the Rusted Garden Homestead. Today I want to give you several tips on starting tomato plants indoors, and we'll cover lighting and really growing and timing getting them out into the garden. The biggest thing that I learned over the years, and I've been testing this out really over the last 2 years, it doesn't matter if your transplant is this tall, that tall, or this tall when getting into the ground. The difference between these three plant sizes looks great indoors, but the main tip is if you don't put this out into the ground when the plant is this big, into warm soil, when the soil temperature is about 60 or 70 degrees, that's what tomatoes like, that's what the warm weather crops like, this plant is just going to sit there, probably turn purple, essentially shiver and not grow until the conditions become right for this plant to thrive. So if you're growing your transplants indoors, getting a massive tomato transplant and then putting it outside in the wrong temperatures is just going to have a plant sit there. So I could grow these indoors, let's just say starting in February, and I don't put them out to maybe April 15th. They get 10 weeks of growing inside. They're massive, they're beautiful. They go into that cold ground, they just sit there. If I start something like this, April 1st, they only get this big when I put them into the ground in May, when that soil temperature is the right temperature. This little plant is going to quickly grow and thrive and catch up to this plant. I basically wasted time growing such a big transplant indoors, spent all that time and resources and effort to grow it, and then I put it out into the wrong temperature. So you want to make sure your tomato plants get into soil that's 60, 70 degrees. You know that is occurring when the days are getting into the upper 60s, 70s. You're getting rains, the nights are staying in the 50s and 60s, and that warmth is coming in and warming up that top 4 to 6 inches of soil. That is the most important tip. It's just, again, I'm going to stress it because a lot of people try and rush these big plants out and they just sit there. That's why sometimes you rush out your transplants. They survive, they do okay, and then some nature seeded tomato plant where you had like a tomato fall from last year, when the temperatures are right, you see that plant take off and thrive, and sometimes it catches up to this plant. I recommend starting 2 or 3 seeds per cell, and then you can thin them down, by just removing them. A lot of people don't like to kill the plant off. I have videos on how you can pop these out, separate them, and then transplant them into other containers so that you save them. It all depends on how many plants you want. But at this stage, you only really want one plant growing in here because you want one plant to use up the root system in here. And that plant will thrive and do better. Next tip is really about the container size. This is your standard 6 cell and 1 tomato plant. That one looks pretty healthy. And this is actually a fine transplant. I also learned over time, dropping this in, like I was saying, into the right temperatures, this plant will take off. When your plants are in a cell, the standard 6 cell, after germination, you really want to get this plant out into the garden within 4 to 6 weeks, or you want to pot it up. When the roots start to get constrained in here and get root bound, you get bigger growth up here because we're feeding it, so you get more greenery, but the root system stays small, and when you put it out into the garden, the root system really isn't equipped to help this plant thrive and take off. So you really want to match timing from container size into either potting up or getting them outside. This container is good for closer to 6, 7 weeks because there's more soil in there. You can get to something like this. I sell all these at my seed shop. That is a really large container, and the tomatoes in here can stay in there easily for 8 weeks. There's just more starting mix and they do better. The plants in here were seeds started on October 24th, so these are 8 weeks of growth after germination, and they really are at the maximum size. You really don't want to grow tomato plants past 8 weeks indoors. There's really no need for it, and when you get past 8 weeks, they start to flower, they start to want to produce fruit. So you really, again, want to get these out into the right conditions, but you want to get them out early enough when they're really growing more of the greenery, they're developing the roots, and they're not focused on flowering. An example of flowering is right here. That's okay because this is a Tiny Tim. I'm growing these indoors. You don't want your tomato transplants to have flowers. And finally, you want stocky plants. So let's talk about lighting. You don't want these plants to be spindly, thin, leggy, and you know, these guys look pretty good. Because there's no air circulation, sometimes putting a fan, a solar fan under your lights helps, because then it's kind of like wind and the plants get a little bit more stocky. But the key is really the distance of the lighting. Let me show you something closer here. Please subscribe and follow. I'll be showing you all kinds of different tips on different plants for growing them indoors for 2023. And you can find on my channel all the information about my grow lights. For the tomato plants, I really wanted to stress, when you're first starting, doesn't matter what kind of cell it's in, you want the lights to be 2 to 3 inches above the seed starting mix. You want to have the lights on before the seeds germinate, like when you're starting to break the surface. You want the seed to break the surface and be hit by light immediately. If you're waiting to turn the lights on until you see germination, it's very possible that you're going to get this really tall, skinny growth, because even 24 hours of missing germination, the plant's going to get leggy. So have your lights on a timer before they germinate. Once they germinate and begin to grow, you want to keep them under a light distance of about 2 or 3 inches. If your lights are more powerful or brighter, you can raise it to 4 to 6 inches, but start a little bit more closely than you think. Leave them under there 7 days, 10 days, 14 days under the lights that are really close. That will help them get nice and stocky, get developed, and then over time you can drop them down. Like these have been growing, they can go down to lights that I have taller, and you can raise the lights that way. You can set up your light station how you wish. Notice how this one is flopping over. Again, that's more respect to just the motion. If you run your hand over your tomato plants or your plants that are your seed starts, they're going to start to toughen up, and they're going to get a little bit stronger in the stem so that they stand straight up. Because there's no wind and there's no motion, sometimes your tomato plants are going to flop over. Those are the main keys, or the main tips that I would recommend when growing your tomato plants indoors. And again, check out my YouTube channel. I've been doing this for 10 years. There are plenty of videos on every single step of growing the tomatoes as seed starts. The main key is really on getting that timing down. Whenever you start them, nowadays I recommend 4 to 6 weeks indoors, and then getting right out into that warm soil so that the plants take off. Thanks for watching. Please check out my seed shop at therustedgarden.com, and please give seed starting a try. You'll have a lot of fun during the winter, and you'll save yourself a lot of money.